In Alex, we noticed and we observed a burst sewer pipe behind the women's hospital, the Helen Joseph hostel. And from the looks of it, it looked like it had been that way for a long period of time because it was basically forming a stream out of the manhole, and there were also burst sewer pipes inside the precinct of the hostel. So I just wanted to find out how this early detection method works and if those are some of the things that it would pick up.
Thank you. I think if in the first instance, something like that should just be reported as a straight service delivery failure or a sewer failure, infrastructure failure. So there are other mechanisms where those things can get reported. And I think I did touch on the fact that I think what is quite tragic is that people have sort of become used to certain things as normative, so they don't actually always report those failures. People sort of learn to live with them and then they don't actually report them. So I can't really account for, there is a protocol in place for responding to sewer blockages, sewer outages that Johannesburg Water, it would be their call to have to, there's a call centre, it gets reported there, or there are different mechanisms to report it. So that's really a straight service delivery issue, which I hope Johannesburg Water covered in their presentation. If there was a very clean baseline, so we are really monitoring in the river. So if you've got a river where your baseline is normally, let's say, acceptable or ideal, which is almost never in most urban rivers, but if it's acceptable, then if you had a sewer spill, a spike, such as that, like an ongoing, but then you would normally have it as a once-off, you might pick that up if it happened a few days before you went to do your monitoring. Or you might pick it up if it's a recurring problem. So to illustrate, in the Klip River, we've got some bulk sewer lines that run in the middle of reeds. So if those things fail, because the reed beds have widened for a whole lot of historic reasons, if they fail, they're not always detected very easily because you only pick it up once the sewage pollution becomes intense and this starts to smell. So you're not seeing that pollution. So it's possible that pollution then is there recurrent for more than a few weeks. Then you're monitoring, because you're only monitoring once a month, so you're going and sampling that river once a month. So if the spill happened the day before or recently, or it's a recurrent ongoing spill, you might detect it. And then your monitoring tool has helped you almost by chance pick up that spill, which there are other ways should be detected just by observation or smell, etc. But the problem with the Yixke through Alex is that the baseline is already so bad. The Yixke it's already unacceptable. So additional sewer spills into that river would not always be picked up by the monitoring because it's already in the unacceptable range. So a little bit more E. coli on top of that measurement is not going to show up as much different. You might get a slightly higher reading, but then if it's a recurrent spill, it's probably the same reading that's happening every month, actually. So obviously, what we would then term that would be a hotspot. So we have got certain sites in the city which we call hotspot areas. So in the past, Swetla has been one of our areas that we call a hotspot because there are recurrent sources of pollution impacting on the river. And then we normally take those hotspots, they almost become, the monitoring program can't solve that. It's almost highlighted it, that here you need to have some special interventions to solve this problem. So we've got we have different hotspots. We've got hotspots where the source is more industrial pollution elsewhere in the city. Then we're going to have a program of intervention, strategic interventions to go and work with those industries to try and address whether that's illegal pollution or failure or whatever. We've had other cases where the source is maybe a single perpetrator we had a pig factory, for example, a pig farm that was a perpetrator, or if we have a community where there's behavioural issues, we will go and then run a program with that community to deal with that hotspot. So it depends on the nature of the pollution. So if there's a recurrent issue and if it's highlighted as a problem area, then one would put additional interventions in place so that the monitoring program can detect a sudden spike. But in general, it's more of a sort of touchstone to give you more of a trend analysis. If you detect a spike, it's normally by chance because it happened to coincide with your monitoring day, or it's a recurrent source of pollution, which then the program does pick up, or it just blends in with the rest of the pollution, in which case it's not really detected. And I think we have to accept that, Alex, the levels are very high. So usually a single source will not be easily detected. So that more would have to be dealt with as someone's reported it, Johannesburg Water respond and go and find the source of that recurring problem. If it's behavioural, then other interventions have to kick in terms of education and awareness. If it's an infrastructure failure, then they deal with it as an infrastructure failure through the upgrading program. That answers.
Yes, thank you. I noticed that you've got on the document that we've been provided that the E. coli levels are rated as unacceptable for the Yuxke. And earlier you mentioned that the Yuxke drains into the Hartbeespoort, is it the dam or the river? I can't recall. The dam. We've heard as the Commission through our Northwest Provincial Office that there are concerns about the level of pollution of the Hartbeespoort Dam, and one of the concerns is the high levels of E. coli among other pollutants. What, if any, to your knowledge, is the City of Johannesburg doing about that? Because if the Yuxke drains into the Hartbeespoort Dam, there's a high possibility that the City of Johannesburg is contributing to the pollution of the Hartbeespoort Dam.
You are correct. This does feed into the Hartbeespoort Dam, so obviously the water quality through this whole catchment has some impact on the dam. One of the bigger impactors on the dam is actually our northern wastewater treatment works, because a river has a way of cleaning itself. So to some extent, some of this pollution that we pick up here in Alex, particularly the E. coli, it's killed off by sunlight over certain, periods of time. So to some extent, the river actually improves on its way to Hartbeespoort Dam. It doesn't just get worse and worse. The river helps to address that. But there are other sources that then contribute to Hartbeespoort Dam, one being our wastewater treatment works, we call it Northern Works, around which we have an extensive program for upgrading and expansion, and other planned sewer works in the area, new sewer works to try and take the load off that. And that's also impacted by a whole lot of problems which are not only infrastructural, they're also ingress of sand, developers linking in that shouldn't be linked in. So I'm just saying there are other sources. And then Hartbeespoort Dam also has E. coli loads feeding in from other municipalities beyond our borders. A lot of the rural residential recreation estates, etc., who have what we call package plants or septic tanks. Some of those systems are also contributing, and some of the municipalities around Hartbeespoort. So we are not a single source causing the problem of Hartbeespoort, but we are a contributor, and there are a lot of actions in place to try and address that, and we are in regular engagement with Department of Water and Sanitation to address some of the sources that contribute to the pollution of Hartbeespoort Dam. It also leads to that big high algae in the dam. Yeah.
Thank you. I also just wanted to find out, with regard to the river cleanup programs, how often do these occur, and does the city then have a mechanism in place for them to be sustained over a long period? Because from what you've reported and from what we were hearing from other parties who've presented before us, is that the issue with Alex is that initiatives are started, but they don't have any longevity. So I just wanted to find out from the city if you're thinking about perhaps now coming up with a long-term plan on ensuring that the river cleanups don't just become an event, but become an ongoing responsibility of both the community and the municipality.
Thank you. Excellent question. We share your concern about the river cleanups as a sort of short-term once off. Unfortunately, we are constrained by budget, so it depends on what budget we get for river cleanups, and we have to cover many areas across the city. So we've got demands for river cleanups all the way from the southern parts of Johannesburg on the Klip through to the northern part. So it's not a lot of money to spread, and we also, those programs are normally funded and linked to job creation programs. So we're also obliged to produce certain jobs, which also is factored into how you structure the actual duration of that program, etc., over how many months. So Traditionally, we are running them only on an annual basis subject to funding, and it would normally be about a 6 to 8 month program, bearing in mind that most of the litter comes during the summer months because it's washed there with rain, so it's always much higher volumes then, so we try and target summer months more. So it's normally about a 6 to 8 month program of actual job creation on the ground, and then it depends on whether you're using fewer people for a longer period or more people for shorter duration period. But we are looking at ways of how we can sustain that, and I think that's where the links to the recycling initiatives comes in, because we need to find a way of ensuring a value chain from the waste that people actually take out of the river, because otherwise it almost perpetuates the notion that, you know, we litter and then we get a job to clean up the river rather than actually addressing the source of the waste in the first instance. So we are trying to link it to recycling programs, and at the moment, and I can't give any commitments on where these are going, but we are currently engaging with, as I said, a number of parties, private sector and others, to look at how we can come up with a more sustainable kind of a cleanup strategy, and then linking that to some kind of reward program, that people, if they don't get direct remuneration, that there is some incentive to help with removing that waste stream from the river and elsewhere in Alex. So we are looking at those programs. And one thing I also forgot to mention is that we are currently, and it's a high level thing, so it doesn't always provide satisfaction for an on-site solution, but we are currently developing a catchment management plan for the Yixkay. And the area that the plan will cover is from Bruma, around through Galuli's, down through Alex, and then as far as Waterval. And out of that plan will come a range of actions, and in that, litter is definitely one of them. And we are also looking for another innovative way of catching litter in what we call small litter traps. So not a big litter trap of the one that I described earlier that we have in Bezuidenhout Park, because that's very costly and it's quite invasive to a river system. It blocks the natural ecological processes that happen in a river, becomes a big dam across the river essentially. So we're looking at smaller kind of litter traps that you could install over stormwater drains from high generation litter sites like taxi ranks, small shopping centres, and where we could link that to some kind of job creation, small entrepreneurship, where someone could be trained to go around with a bakkie and clear those baby litter traps that are not invasive, that we call them off-stream. So we wouldn't put them in the main river, we would put them on some of the side tributaries. So we're in the process of exploring the technical feasibility of some of those kind of systems. So we're looking at a range of options for trying to address waste and link it to job creation so it can be a bit more sustainable. And I also forgot to mention that we do have education and awareness programs, and always with the river cleanups there's an element of education and awareness that happens, some more than others. I think the ones that have proved more sustainable is where a large part of the budget is actually invested in actually going also to find out why people are dumping or why there's littering. Sometimes it's businesses who haven't got sufficient bins, and sometimes it's communities without facilities, or sometimes it's just straight behavioural issues. So we do try and target education and awareness together with the river cleanups.
And I was hoping you could perhaps clarify something for us in your presentation. There's a section under the heading monitoring points in the vicinity of Alexandra. I just wanted to find out the numbers in the last two column, are those coordinates?
Those are coordinates, and for some reason, and I'm afraid I can't answer why these ones don't have coordinates. I think these are quite recent. Okay. Some of our points have had to be moved. So we do have a plan, and we document when we move a point, because we try and keep consistency, which you need for scientific reference. But we have had to, from time to time, adjust a point where access becomes difficult or safety becomes an issue, or in parts of the water is just not flowing. So I think those are some of the points that have recently been moved and they haven't had their points verified.
Okay, yeah. That was actually, you preempted my next question. Thank you for that. That will be all, Chairperson.
Thank you for your presentation. I have about 4 questions. Is the quality of water safe for human consumption in Alexandra? if you've indicated in your presentation that the chemical quality is acceptable and the E. coli is unacceptable. So I'm of the assumption that there will be instances whereby the chemical quality could actually affect the consumption of the water. Could you just expatiate on that? Is the water actually safe? And most specifically in places like Sitwetla?
I think what I explained in the beginning is that this is not, that your flowing river is not expected to be a source of water for consumption in an urban area. I can't speak for rural areas, but certainly here, potable water is what we refer to as water that is actually deemed fit for human consumption. So that's Johannesburg Water's task, to ensure that the water through the taps, in tankers, whatever, is fit for human consumption. Our reference is more of an ecological river health reference, and the indice targets the acceptable, what's deemed to be acceptable in that class, in those bands that are in the report, is only regarded as acceptable for recreational use. So it's sort of contact sport. If you're having a canoe and you get splashed by the water, are you okay? Even then, they wouldn't suggest that someone goes swimming. So it's not deemed to be fit for human consumption because it's not expected, it's not planned that people should be now drawing water from the resource. So it's not safe for human consumption. And I think the concern is that people do use it in some instances for human consumption in this environment, because that's why people are also located next to a river, because it's an easy informal water source. So our target is not the same as a drinking water standard would be. Yeah.
You did indicate that when it comes to using the biofilters is less costly and a less costly measure, and that some of these filters do filter out the E. coli. Is this a sustainable measure? Is it temporary or sustainable?
Okay. It depends again. It's entirely dependent on where you are placing these measures, whether it's on side tributaries, whether it's in the main tributary. You can't really put what we call a biofilter or an artificial wetland or some kind of, it's new kind of, we refer to it as green infrastructure. It's using nature's wisdom and nature's lessons to actually help manage certain problems. So instead of putting a big engineered filter, you actually would use nature to do what nature does naturally, and you mimic what nature's doing. So you can't really put it in stream in the main channel because of the water flows, because it'll just be washed away. It'll just become debris in the system. So you would normally try and do it on the side tributaries, or what we did at the Queen's one is we redirect some of the water in the middle flow rate. So you've got very low flows, then we have what we call a base flow, which is your middle zone flow, and then we have high flow when you get a storm event. So we would redirect that water through it. But you can, it is sustainable if you put it on some of the small tributaries, and we are exploring some of those measures. Some of that will be looked at as part of the catchment plan. I know that other municipalities and internationally there are programs where, in fact, they've dealt with precisely these kind of problems of high E. coli through implementing green infrastructure initiatives with these wetlands. And the thing is, they're partly self-sustaining, and also you can teach communities how to look after them, remove sediment, remove litter, trim reeds, etc. Because normally they're planted up with plants that help you take up those nutrients out of the water. So it's not one size fits all. It's entirely dependent on the hydrology of a particular catchment, where you would place them, what they can do. And they have a certain space requirement, so you can't just do them anywhere. Yeah. Got to stand for long enough for them to be able to do their job. So if it's a fast-flowing area and you can't get enough space, you're not going to place it there because it wouldn't be effective.
Thank you for that. And these biofilters, can they be put on the Chesky River around Alexandra to filter?
Well, those are some of the things we're looking at, and the one project that I looked at, that I mentioned, which is not our project, so I'm talking about someone else's project. It's a project that Wits University is now looking at, but they are looking at really above ground you can get big, huge biofilters, you get little baby ones. It's all dependent on what you're trying to manage. They are looking at this possibility of installing these little strips, I would say, of biofilters in between the shacks where people can, it would at least deal with the sullage water, because, some of the water finding its way into Alex is just soapy water, dishwater, or just so it should help to deal with some of that. If we were looking at in Alex, we would be looking at some of the tributaries that come through past the East Bank. Or the problem in Schroeter is really a space one, because we can't. We've heard how difficult it is to get anybody to move or to move anybody, and you have to have space to implement. So we've actually had a study recently called our Green Infrastructure Strategy, which took Alex as a case study to say, could we implement biofilters in Alex? And one of the biggest constraints, though, is coming out is that it's difficult to find space where you can make those effective. So that it's still in exploratory territory, but these are some of the constraints that we come up against.
Sorry. Be my last question. So you did indicate about erosion protection measures. Is this still being done? Because when we went for a local inspection in Sitwetla, those houses, those structures that are built along the floodline, did not seem to have any protection measures there. And I would like to find out what they look like and how long has it been, if there are any measures, what are these measures? What are these erosion protection measures that have been set place in Sitwetla, if there's any?
The erosion protection measures that I referred to are probably many years ago and probably no longer in place, given what has happened to the Alex banks. So we have got other erosion measures that are still being done upstream to try and reduce the amount of sediment, because that also helps with flooding. If you have less, when you get a lot of sediment into a river basin, it also reduces the capacity of that basin to carry flood water. So there's a bit of a correlation, and I'm not really speaking for Alex so much because I'm not a hydrological engineer that's actually modeled this, so I'm not sure how it affects, but it certainly affects flooding in other areas in the city where we've got a lot of sediment that's settled out in a particular area, and then the river overtops its banks because it has nowhere else to go during a flood event. In Alex, I think the flow of that river, the volume and the energy of that river is probably sweeps all the sediment with it and dumps it somewhere else lower downstream. But we haven't gone into to stabilize those banks. We've had some projects which would like to do that, but until we can resolve the encroachments and the illegal dumping, it's futile to spend public money trying to stabilize banks, because essentially those are not real banks. They are banks with rubble that's unstable material. So the project or the investigation that I referred to that the city funded in the past 2 years had engineers looking at precisely these issues. Where could they secure banks? In other words, so even if there's rubble, is there a way of making that rubble safe, and you're almost stealing new land from the floodplain? Or do you have to remove it? Because the danger of stabilizing a bank that's already in a floodplain, and most of these areas in Schroeter are already in the danger zone of flooding, is that you are implying to people that we can make you safe. We're going to secure the bank, so you're okay if you live here. And there's a huge risk in doing that because they are in the floodplain, and unless you can find a way of reducing those flood lines, which is almost impossible in this catchment because you've got to find a lot of storage upstream which you don't have space for. If you just model, if you just do the numbers to say where would you have to stop the water for it not to flood here, it's just not looking very feasible. So if you stabilize those banks, they're just going to wash out because you're actually in a floodplain where the water wants to naturally erode that bank. So we would normally stabilize where we can create a cutback, and we it's going to be sustainable, and we're not going to waste public money on a project that's just going to be swept away.
Just a follow-up question. So in the interim, you're saying that the banks will not be stabilized until such a point the rubble and the illegal dumping is dealt with. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it's a combination. It has to be modeled.
Yes.
So all these things have to be, model. There are engineers who have to look at the stability. They have to look at where the floodline is now, what the flow rates are. Will that rubble just wash out? Is there a way of making that rubble safe? Because I think, to people who go there, they think, well, you can just compact it and somehow it will stay there. But it's a very, very high-risk catchment in terms of flows. And I actually had a discussion with an engineer yesterday on this very point. So we can't stabilize rubble that's already in the floodplain unless we've modeled it, there are proper engineering designs to see whether you can treat that as permanent land reclamation and it doesn't have an impact. Because remember that every bit of storage we steal from the river here is having another impact downstream. So we might be making this area stable and now we're creating flooding downstream because water has an action-reaction. So at the moment, we are going back to that study which looked at precisely that. It looked at where the floodlines are now, whether it could in any way alter those floodlines to create more safety for people, and it looked at the whole issue of where rubble needs to be removed, where it could be allowed to remain. And we were also looking at whether we could use the rubble, some of it in situ, to actually help with the problem. So could we crush that rubble and actually turn it into something useful as a building material or to help create some of the flood management measures. But it's all in the studies, and I'm not the expert, so I don't want to commit to the actual outcome. But I think that, they did quite a good job in trying to address all these challenges. But everything has to be looked at holistically. You can't pull one piece out without the other.
Thank you for that. That will be all. Thank you.
Thanks, City Manager and the team. This team was on Alex on the 3rd of May this year on foot, and we inspected, amongst other things, at Stwetla, the quality of surface water, more so the part of Chaskei River around Stwetla, Silvertown. And I'm sorry that I have to preface myself in an accusatorial manner, because these processes are supposed to be inquisitorial as opposed to being accusatorial. But having been there and observed for ourselves, I think it's common cause, and it's a trite fact that the extent and the enormity of waste, talking about solid waste and pollution on that river, especially that estuary at Silvertown, is so immeasurable, and it amounts to eyesore. But maybe let me just pause there. I don't want to give you to dispute that if you want to. Because for me to sit here and listen to a presentation whereby you talk about all these programs that are in place to clean up the surface water in Alex, it really doesn't dovetail with what we saw on the ground, which is why I'm saying I wanted to pause, to give you an opportunity to pause to that. Because if at all those programs are there, as you want to have us believe, then they are too little or of no practical effect. Because the conditions as they prevail along that river, they have serious and direct implications on the right to a clean environment that the people of Alex are entitled to in terms of Section 24 of the Constitution. But maybe before I go any further, the immediate question from my side will be to ask you if you have been in a position to identify the cause and the source of all this litter that is happening around Chaskei River at the moment, especially in Alex. because we are sitting here for Alex. Because for me, that is the starting point, the sources. Have you identified the sources of all the litter that is currently there? Because ironically enough, as we were on the ground, solid waste was being thrown. Some of the homemade sewer pipes from the shacks in the neighborhood could be observed straight from the shacks and depositing sewer into the river. But again, my question is, have you identified the sources of this litter to start with? Because before you can even talk about programs, the most important thing is to deal with the sources. Because it's no use to come up with the programs to clean up the river if you don't address the sources of the litter.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to let the rest of the team answer some part of it, but I'll answer it in the part that I can. Just to say that the waste, look, the waste comes from all over. So some of the waste is generated in Alex itself, as you saw. So when the rain comes, that waste is going to wash either into a stormwater drain, into the river, or just overland into the bank, or it's people just walking across and putting their waste in the river. So that would relate to the whole issue of services, which I'm not really in a position to comment on. Maybe the city manager will be able to address that. But I do know that because we do have colleagues in the waste section, and I'm not from that section, but there is a bit of a struggle in finding suitable receptacles that work in Alex, because they've tried bins. The bins have largely disappeared, so there's a problem with finding a receptacle that works. Some of the skips have not worked, and skips are really regarded as quite an outdated sort of last resort option to leave a big skip for people to put waste in. But certainly the bins, unfortunately, are used for other uses than waste. So I know that Pick It Up and the city are currently looking together at really almost creating a specific receptacle for waste in Alex that would work and not be recyclable itself. So that's one thing. But the other waste comes from, I mean, I was on site 2 weeks ago for another project, and unfortunately we've got residents in formal houses who are also just dumping domestic waste. So some of it's just behavioural issues. People are taking domestic waste and putting it in the stream. We saw tiles, we saw bags, or even on the park. And then it's on the park. You can clean it on the park, but that's not sustainable to constantly have to go back and deploy more and more and more resources to clean waste that should have been put out on a domestic ground. Or it's going to wash into the river, and then you're going to be cleaning it from the river, which it's not sustainable. So I agree with you. So one is always looking at the sources, which I mentioned, those small litter traps, trying to look at. But again, obviously, the first prize would be to stop the litter getting onto the ground in the first place. And those are the service delivery, behavioural issues. Once it's on the ground, to try and prevent it getting to the river, we have those other secondary interventions where we're very new. And they're not going to initially make a huge difference, because ultimately you've got to stop the waste stream. So all these programs are happening, but the scale of the waste stream is sort of counterbalances the efforts. And people doing river cleanups also get demoralized because they clean, and then while they're cleaning, someone's coming with a wheelbarrow and putting the waste back in the river, and it's actually quite demoralizing for them. Or the next rainstorm comes and brings a whole lot of new waste. So if we work with the tributaries, which is one of the methods that has proven internationally successful, you get custodial care of some of the feeder tributaries, and we get residents to look after those. That should then start to reduce the waste in the mainstream. So it's a combination. I can't speak for the service delivery issues around waste, but certainly we are trying to look at the sources, and the sources are quite diverse. They're from single sources to just the general environmental issues, which I think have been well described to the Commission through these hearings. And then the illegal connections, again, Johannesburg Water, presumably you should talk to that, but we refer those to our counterparties if we pick them up on site visits. But that is now also linked to the whole issue of illegal structures and some of the legal issues that have already been debated earlier here today, because people will look at how they service their structure once it's there, but we witnessed the exact same things, which is quite shocking. So we are from the water department, water division, and it's an oversight, and it's the water resource management. So it's not directly the service delivery component, but we do work with our partners on all the issues you've touched on. But it's a moving target. You know, it's not a silver bullet to stop the waste stream that impacts on this area. I don't know if the CM wants to add to that, or maybe our environmental health person, because they also conduct education and awareness.
Thank you very much for the question, and good afternoon to the commissioners. My name is Peter Manganye. I'm the Director for Environmental Health in the City of Johannesburg. You know, waste management is one of the 9 municipal health services as defined in terms of the National Health Act. And the role of environmental health in the main is that of, health promotion, awareness creation, and not the provision of waste collection services, because that's a function of Pick It Up. So we do conduct, health awareness programs in Alex around various topics that we are responsible for, waste being one of them, But I think, as Jane has indicated, in Alex, one of our biggest challenges is the density that you find in that space. I think the rate of generation of waste, could, to some degree, outstrip our ability to collect on a much more regular and frequent basis. So that's in the main what environmental health, deals with. It's education, it's awareness, and law enforcement to an extent where we see a person dumping, then we are able to act in terms of the bylaws of the city. It's a function that we share. The law enforcement part, we share it with JMPD colleagues. Thank you.
Name is Sipomati, Director in the City of Joburg. In addition to what my colleagues have said, and I think some of those sources that they've mentioned, I think the key thing is really the behavioral issues that we need to deal with, the changing the mindset of our residents. And one of our programs that the city manager has invited you in, the Hartbeespoort. Hartbeespoort is an approach where let's all clean our community all together, the city and the community. So we are taking the Kigali approach, where we want our residents to take ownership of the cleanliness of their area. Other than that, it becomes the the issue of the local government.
I think I've noted issues such as behavioral patterns, general cleanliness, amongst other things, as contributing factors to the pollution of surface water, especially Chaskei River. But I want to put, not as a declarative statement, but as an alternative to the truth, over and above those that we have identified. And interesting enough, you also spoke to it, though in passing, talking about illegal structures. So, according to my observation, and I'm not trying to be subjective or making a declarative statement at this stage, because this inquiry is still very much ongoing. It's the issue of informal settlements along the banks of the river. How on earth would you expect to clean up that river when you have so much informal settlements along the banks, which brings into the table again the issue of provision of housing. And I'm not trying to sneak it back through the back door in this forum, because we are not necessarily here about housing. Today we are sitting here trying to look at environmental issues, but as you may see for yourself, issues are interlinked. So when you have so much informal settlers right on the flat line, on the water line, with no services, how on earth do you expect to be successful in your cleanup operations of that river when those people are living there? Is it practical? I'll pause there.
I'll try and answer the part I can, and other colleagues may want to add. You're completely correct, which is why this has always been regarded as a hotspot area. And I think the problem is going back about, Swetla's been there a long time. So when it was quite small, there was an expectation that the ARP program was going to provide new accommodation, and that Swetla would actually at some stage cease to exist, that the informal settlements would be dealt with through the new residential development and housing programs. That was many years ago, though, and I think the scale of new migration into Alex and the scale of the structures has now gone, way beyond a simple, well, we'll move these 50 units on a program to move there. But from a water quality perspective, at one stage, that was the expectation, that this was a temporary problem that would be addressed once Swetla structures were no longer there and those people were moved into formal accommodation. At present, we in the water department can't solve that problem. So that then becomes linked to we then have to rely on the human settlements and our housing department and others to then address the accommodation needs to deal with the informal settlements, because we can't work alone. So you're correct in your analysis, but we can only take it so far. We have to look at short term, we intervene from our position around more operational issues. If we find, for example, that the location of the chemical toilets is not conducive to people using them, or they're not being serviced regularly enough, or they're placed where women feel unsafe to go there at night. So we try and almost be a facilitator to improve those things which we feel are under our control or which we can help to influence. But the bigger picture of human settlements, I think we heard at the last hearing, is linked to a much bigger redevelopment vision, and I'd rather have someone else on the team address that issue, not my competence. So,
and again, I want to qualify myself. I'm not trying to bring the issue of housing, but it seems to be intrinsically linked to environmental cleanliness. The density that you talk about, it's the same thing. This administration has been in office for over 2 years now. Can you give us a picture of what step has it done with regard to de-densifying Alex, especially around the banks of Chaskei? Surely in 2 years, in 2.5 years, you must have done something with regard to provision of housing, removing those people there, taking them to alternative adequate housing. 2 years is quite a reasonable amount of time. Something could have been done. Can you give us a picture there? We know the Alex issue is very old, and it dates back to colonialism, but you've been in office for 2 years yourself. Surely there is something you could have done in these 2 years.
Thanks. I think you're certainly correct about some of these informal settlements that are in around the Just K area. I think as the city, our effort is to really, we are now enumerating some of these informal settlements. So part of the enumeration is that we've got the team that would then go on site and enumerate each and every household, how many people are there, who are there. It's a first phase of upgrading of the informal settlement. But then once we get the understanding of the people who are there, I think we then look at the second phase of the informal settlement. The second part is then we looking at the geotech part of it, where we look at the land survey and all of those issues. I think part of the key thing is when we do enumeration is to look at if reallocate some of these people. How many are there if we get them into a formal, into a very properly laid out areas. And I think one of the things that we have done is that we want to, when we do the layout plans, is that we find above that it might still be in an informal area. But the key issue is that those areas where we relocate in the area where it's appropriately allocated the stands, and they're able then to receive services such as water, electricity in a properly areas of settlement.
In short, you are still planning, because that sounds very much like planning stage. Nothing has been delivered as yet.
Thank you for that key question. If you look at our IDP, you will clearly see that we have got a formalization process throughout Johannesburg, 1. We also have the concept of service stands, number 2, throughout the city of Joburg. What determines how many do we do? The mayor has told you that he has a backlog of almost 300,000 households. How much is a house times 300,000? Is that something that is that the backlog that you can eat in 1 or 2 years? You can't. Is the prioritization matrix? Yeah, there is. So do we do these activities alone? You know where the competencies of housing and the grants come from. So, yes, things could have been quicker. But who would have such amount of money to plan and kill it, the entire backlog in Joburg in 2 years? No one could. So I think there are those issues. It's not the lack of goodwill and intentions. It's, look at it from the funding point of view as well.
Thanks, City Manager. I will obviously conclude that you are still planning in terms of the IDP as you spell it out, not delivered.
Let me correct that through you, Chairperson. There would be areas where the plans are ready, even environmental's done, even geotech's done, but the resources are not there. So those you would call projects in the pipeline. So you would have projects that are ready but unfunded. So it's not that it's perpetual planning, though.
Thanks. Let me move to the second question, still on the issue of quality of surface water. While we were on the 2 migrant labor hostels, Women's Hostel, Helen Joseph, and then the other one, Matala Hostel, we also observed for ourselves plumbing and sewer pipes from those 2 hostels, which had visible signs of lack of maintenance, which are leaking and contributing to a lot of surface retention or raw sewer on the premises of the hostel, which can solely be attributed to lack of maintenance of those plumbing and sewer pipes, thereby compromising the health of the residents of those hostels. And you could easily tell that the situation has been like that for a long time. Now, we know and I acknowledge that hostels themselves are an unfortunate relic of apartheid. And you may as well just be telling us about reconfiguration plan to turn them into family units. But as it stands now, people are living with raw sewer there. Dams, actually, dams of raw sewer on those hostels. In the 2 years that you have been in office, have you changed sewer pipes? Have you maintained those hostels? Whilst maybe you are going on about programs of reconfiguration and turning them into family units, because the health of people is at risk. Those dams of sewer there is impacting directly on their health. It's harmful to their well-being. Because from what I observe, but this is subject to correction, those sewer pipes have not been maintained, at least for the past 10 years or so, if not 25 years. In the 2 years that you have been in office, have you maintained hostels in any way or form?
Thank you very much for that question. We have said that during last financial year, the backlog in repair and maintenance was a minimum of 170 billion alone. Some issues as life-threatening, as you said, some issues unplanned, some issues neglected for very long. It boils down to resources, but we have attended to the issues that you raised, and we removed staff that shouldn't be there. And we wish we could do more. You are right. Not only the hostels, also the old age home. The city has agreed, it's written down, where the city says on council-owned buildings like the old flats, the old age home, and the hostels, we are not doing enough maintenance. In fact, we even went as far as thinking that some of the units can be given to the people who are staying there, so that maybe they might look after them better. So yes, I'm glad you said maintenance was not there for 10 years. It's not only the hostel. Some saw life and economy threatening that we have to shift resources. Let me make a simple example with the M2 bridge, which was in such a state that we couldn't allow traffic. And we planned for it? We didn't. Is it something that happened in our 2 years? Not necessarily. So a project like that had to jump prioritization so that it can be done. Do you want to wake up and hear that M2 bridge has collapsed? Absolutely not. So There are areas that more can be done, that we have admitted. We have spoken and quantified to an extent the repair and maintenance backlog that is there. I've mentioned the 170 billion. Roads and stormwater alone quantified a very high amount. So look at the city's budget and think of how many times you would do 170 billion worth of backlog. It's not something that you would finish in 2 years. There are many areas that we know, but the backlog has come at a huge amount. We can't pick that at once.
Thanks, City Manager. It's interesting that we're talking about backlog, which is you're talking about something that you, or maybe let me just leave that question. I will move on to my last question. This is another thing because we are talking about communal. Sorry, we're talking about quality of surface water in and around Alex. Another thing which defies logic here is the issue of communal taps. In areas such as Twetla, whereby you have rightfully provided rudimentary services to the people in those informal settlements, such as communal taps, whereby at least 100 families will share one communal tap. We have observed a very disturbing incident linked to those communal taps. At least from those that I personally observed, they are not linked to any form of stormwater or sewer. As a result, you see surface water running through the shacks, and the residents are complaining that it's forever damp, and they are forever sick because of that. Now, when you are presenting here about certain programs being in place to address surface water and the quality of surface retention in and around Alex, it doesn't make sense when you install in communal taps and then don't link them to any form of stormwater. I don't know, we want to comment on that.
Look, we acknowledge that. Obviously, when you are designing the tap, you almost think the people will, open onto a container. When the container is full, they will close and then go away. When you have to do what you are suggesting, it saves water, but it increases the amount per standpipe, which might then inadvertently reduce the number of standpipes that are to be put. But we can always look at that. It's not that we intentionally want to disadvantage the citizens.
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, that was my last question. But please, that will be much appreciated, because not only are they fetching water from those taps, they do washings there, and they will throw water right there. Children are playing in the background. It's a mess. It's just damp. The water is running throughout the neighboring shacks, and it doesn't look very good as far as the quality of health of the people living under those damp conditions due to communal taps that are not linked to sewer pipes. And that concludes the question from my side.
Thank you for your submissions. Right to an environment has two faces. There's the more humanitarian one regarding environment's effect on a person's health, direct effect on their well-being, and then also the more ecological aspect of the general right to have the environment conserved and protected. I'd like to focus more on the first aspect, and also pull in something that my colleague from the Public Protector said about how the rights are interlinked, and that if you are living on the bank of a river, that the environmental impact of that river can affect not just your right to a clean environment, but also your right to access to adequate housing. So, living in a house that is polluted and constantly smelling of sewage, that's not an adequate home. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to speak about a submission from the city, specifically regarding the fact that the water is not intended for human consumption. Does that detract from the fact that it is consumed, it is used, it does form part of these people's lives, people who live in Alexandra? And to that extent, are there any studies or reports from within the city or any other department that you're aware of that speak to the actual health effects, case studies, medical studies, showing that, showing whether or not the bacterial issues in this water directly affect the health of people? Because we don't want to just assume that, but is there a report about that?
Thank you very much for the question. I'll take that one. My colleague who looks after clinics in Alex is not here, but as far as I am aware, we haven't, received any report at the central office that links the type of diseases that they treat or see in our primary healthcare facilities in Alex to the extent of the pollution in the rivers. So perhaps it's an area that we would encourage them to begin to look at, to say, what is the disease profile? Largely what is being reported on through our primary healthcare facilities speaks to mainly your disease of lifestyle. Maybe we should also extend, the request to clinics that are managed by our provincial colleagues, because the level of care that they look at, it's at your secondary and tertiary type of level, which could then directly link some cases to the pollution of the water surfaces in Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, noted. My second and final question regards safety more directly, and safety around the Yukske River and the more densely populated areas on the banks of that river. There was a comment made that people don't report these issues because they're kind of used to them. I have to make a comment there and say that's not the case. People are not used to it at all. When we went there, complaints we generally receive from people all over, not just in Alex, is they never get used to this. They just give up on reporting because they report and nothing happens. That's what we're told, at least, and those are the allegations we receive. So that would be the reason. I think it's people who don't live in sewage-infested areas don't mind. So, but if you actually live there, it's different, and that's why in 2017, I think, if memory serves, there was a resolution in the municipal council that a gate was supposed to be built along the gate or fence was supposed to be built along the banks of the Yukske in the more densely populated areas. This was mainly as a result of a child who fell in the river and died around that time. And that still hasn't been built. But my part of the question is, if it had been built, if right now it were built, would it improve the environmental aspect of the river? Would it reduce pollution? Would it make your jobs easier? Is there another reason for that fence to be built, even though it hasn't been built yet?
Through you, Chairperson, just to correct something that I think have been misquoted by the Fourth Estate. There is this issue circulating that says I have issued the instruction to demolish. Obviously, such statements put me at a higher risk than I usually am. Can you allow me to just clarify that I have indicated that I'm the accounting officer, which is a legislated function. And I have said that there is an investigation that is aimed at finding what happened on that day. And it is after this investigation that we'll be able to say what has happened and who did what and who authorized what. So I think the statement that says I have said I've authorized the demolitions, let me put it on record that it is not true. But I have admitted that I am an accounting officer. And the accounting officer, it's a legally defined term for an institution.
Noted. Thank you. Answer to my question now, please.
Okay. I wasn't party to that mayoral resolution that you referred to. I'm aware of a resolution, but I don't know the exact wording. But I think it's the resolution that also led to the study that I referred to, which has been looking at, essentially, I think a fence was just something thrown out, but it was options for making people safer on the banks there. And so to try and answer your question more directly, if indeed a fence was erected, there's a high likelihood, given where people are in relation to the floodline, given the force of the water, there's a likelihood of a couple of things. A, that the fence just gets stolen for scrap metal. That's the truth of the matter. And it just disappears piece by piece. It would have to be a permeable fence because we can't, and I'll explain just now why, we can't build a wall there at the present. So the fence would have to still allow for floodwaters to come through. So what it would do, it would potentially serve to stop children, just accessing a river more easily. It would potentially stop some of the dumping because it would just act as a kind of deterrent, saying, the buck stops here. We have looked at other measures to create a similar kind of a barrier mentality, which was more trying to build a road, but it involved also the potential relocation, which is now a double-edged sword. We wanted to try and move people back from the floodline and put a road on the floodline, which would sort of serve as an indication of you're safer on this side of the road. If you go on the other side of the road, you are not safe. And it wouldn't only be for that, it would also be for safety of access, because at the moment the problem is even during a flood event, emergency vehicles struggle to get access quickly to where they need to get because of the dense shacks on the river. So that was one mechanism which was similar intentions, can I say, to a fence. But the other issue that has been mooted, I'm afraid we are at odds even with our decision makers who sometimes the idea sounds nice, but we cannot, I'm advised by engineers that we cannot put a berm up there to stop the water coming in for the reasons I think that I tried to articulate earlier, that people are already in the floodline. A floodline is not a perfect science. It might serve as a protection for some flood events, but given the changes to our weather patterns, given the high risk of flooding in that catchment, a berm can create a sense of false safety, that we say to people, if you sit behind the berm or behind this wall, you're okay. And then we are almost creating a situation where we are adding to people's false sense of safety, because that can fail and the water comes, it pushes that water over and it comes like a wave. It's deadly. So at the moment, people have a little bit more of an early warning of the rising water, although it still comes with quite some force. But if we create an actual barrier to floodwaters, we are we are really creating a problem, a bigger problem. So that's why the study then sort of went on from that to say, but could we alleviate the problem in different ways by trying to create storage upstream rather than creating an artificial barrier? So I think the fence became part of a bigger study, is my understanding. And just to say, we do have, from an emergency services point of view, Alex is one of the areas that has the most attention given to it in terms of emergency services. So we do have some early warning sirens. All the flow rate meters that the city has invested in tend to be located on that catchment to detect early rising of floodwater. And a lot of disaster management awareness and disaster preparedness is focused on Alex because of the high risk. So that's all I can say from my knowledge. I don't know if the city manager has anything he wants to add.
No, thank you. That's the end of my questions.
Thank you. What is your position again at the City of Johannesburg?
My current position is Deputy Director, Open Space Planning. But when I first appeared, and this is sort of a continuation of that, I was wearing the hat of Acting Director for Water and Biodiversity. So I'm here appearing, in a sense, in that capacity.
Is your previous position vacant?
We're just in the process of handing over to the next acting person. It's a vacant position, and we act in rotation. Yeah.
Well, when were you last in Alex?
Probably about 4 months ago. I can't remember the exact date, but I was there to look at. I was last in Alex on the East Bank about 2 weeks ago, but looking at the actual Sweatler problem with the dumping and the silage probably about 4 months ago.
And how often do you go to Alex with your team?
No, I don't go directly because it's not normally my substantive position. So I would only go there if I have a project under my particular directorate. And I would only go there on an acting basis if I was called to for a special project, because the person who would more regularly go there is our water quality specialist, who was here at the last day. She's not here today, and she works with environmental health on the actual water monitoring program. So she's the one who checks on where the samples are being taken. If there's a hotspot, as has been referred to at the hostel, etc., she would be the one on the ground going with teams to look at problems, sometimes with environmental health, sometimes with Joburg Water, sometimes with housing. So we have a water quality specialist, and it's her catchment. She would be much more regularly on the ground, and I would only go if there's a special project or a special delegation to look at a particular issue.
Where is she today? Why is she not here?
I think we didn't expect that you needed that level of detail, that we could cover the level of detail that was required, because we were told it was just a question on the actual monitoring program, we thought.
But you had approximately 2 weeks to ask for clarity before this sitting.
If you need her to come back, we can certainly get her, but then if we could just hear what the particular question is that we need to get from her.
Has the city ever conducted a social impact assessment of the Yakske on the community of Alexandra?
Not that I'm aware of. It wouldn't be our mandate to conduct such a thing. That would probably, I don't know if it would fall under community development or social development. So our mandate is really about ensuring that the water in the channel is clean. So we are looking at much more in terms of the second, the second element that was highlighted by the previous commissioner. So that would be more, I don't know, community development or maybe environmental health. My colleague sitting here, I'm not aware of anything.
Would you say currently the Yakske River and the general socio-economic environment in Alex poses severe threats to the health of people of Alex?
I'd rather the environmental health person answer that in terms of, you're saying specifically to health. It's certainly a risky environment, from but the levels of exposure of risk would, in a pure academic form of definition of risk exposure, I think would probably be relative to the issue. So there would be health risks and then there would be safety risks, certainly. But the degree will obviously be those living closer to the river have a much higher degree of risk. I wouldn't generalize to necessarily the whole of Alex, although maybe to do with other water-related issues, but not Yexkay specifically. I think the higher risk is the people who depend on the Yexkay for their day-to-day sort of livelihood.
Talking about dependence on the Yexkay River, are you aware that there are people who use the Yexkay for religious and traditional practices?
I'm aware of it on other parts. I'm not aware of it directly it's certainly come out of studies on other sections of other catchments, but I'm not aware of it directly in Alex, no.
Is the city aware that there are people using the Yexkay for religious and traditional practices?
Thanks for the question. I think I have seen people, using not only the Yexkay River, but rivers in general, for baptism.
When did you see people in Yexkay? Well, when was it?
Sure. I think, it's...
And remember, even though you are not under oath, you cannot lie to this inquiry.
No, I cannot say specific dates, but I think it's, I would say it's like common practice for people to use rivers for baptism in the main.
Are your interventions based on sound research and information?
I think I have to answer that in relation to the different interventions. So certainly we have conducted over the years, and I'm going back now 15 years, we have from time to time we have undertaken proper studies. So there was a way back about 10 years ago, there was a Yexkay environmental framework that was formulated, and that certainly did a lot of studies and came up with, would have highlighted some of the issues you're raising now, because we did one for the Klip and one for the Yexkay. So it certainly looked at the social use of rivers and dependency, and would have had all that. It's just that it's probably still fairly valid, but it's not up to date. So some of the issues would be common, but that's quite a dated study, and we haven't had funding to do a new study until the study we are about to embark on now. So we have had that study. Any rehabilitation projects are always based on, proper science, but that's more around engineering and water quality issues. The social study we normally do in relation to if we're going to develop something that's going to impact directly on a community. So if we're going to go and work on a bank where people are living, if we're going to go and develop a park, if we're going to do anything that's going to directly affect residents living in the vicinity, there always is a social impact study done as part of the project development plan, and also as part of the environmental impact, because most of our work has environmental impact assessments. And then we always also engage with the ward councillor to work through the ward council and the Speaker's office with the forum. So they certainly, normally, if we're going in with a particular intervention, we would always engage with the community before we go in with that intervention. Yeah.
How often do you run awareness campaigns in Alex around environment, water quality, and sanitation?
Thank you for that question. I think it's difficult for me to give exact details because the environmental awareness and education is run by various different, it's a bit of a cross-sectoral function. So I know that our policy people are doing quite a lot of work in schools in Alex. So they would go and run specific education awareness, working with schools to try and educate school kids. And then City Parks does some education and awareness as part of their programs. Then I say there's also education awareness linked to some of the actual programs, like the river cleanup has that element of education and awareness. And then I can't speak for the other departments. I think environmental health probably also have some programs, and I know our waste people are also, with Pick It Up, they also run awareness. I think there's different entry points and different stakeholders depending on the nature of the issue. Yeah.
Are you aware of the environmental state of the Alexandra Cemetery?
I am, yeah, because we've been dealing with it via our compliance division, yeah.
What do you mean by dealing with it? Well, what have you done?
Well, we get complaints, so it's been referred to.
What have you done with those
I don't know,
complaints?
I'll have to ask the city manager because it doesn't fall in.
Good afternoon, I'm Liziwe. I'd introduce myself. I'm the Regional Director for Region E. Yes, we are aware of the state of the Alexandra Cemetery. And just to qualify some of the questions that you had posed to her, we conduct integrated operations, education drives. We partner with other departments as well, and ESCOM. We even have one that is scheduled to take place on the 21st. We normally combine those education drives with cleanup operations. We've had various number of them. It's just that I don't have the details of the dates when those were held, but we hold them on a regular basis. Let me allow you to ask more questions about the cemetery.
Now, I'll move on to, because we discussed the cemetery in the previous sitting. I see on Twitter today the city is hosting an event or an initiative to commemorate or to celebrate the World Environment Day. Do you think it's appropriate for the city to be using money to celebrate this, given the ongoing challenges in Alexandra? Or would you say Alexandra, maybe this event could have been held in Alex as part of amplifying their concerns? City manager, as the accounting office.
Okay, thank you very much. If you agree, let's rather come back to you with the facts. If indeed city money was used and how much. Sometimes with events, it can happen that the city joins events organized by others. Sometimes the city contributes to events with others. Sometimes the events are also linked to other goals of the city. So if you agree, let me come back, even if it's in writing, to you on the event.
That's fine. Thank you, sir. Just to wrap up, would you agree that the river as we speak is devoid of aquatic life?
I think devoid, it's not devoid, it doesn't score high on our River Health Index, which is a score based on, we call it the present ecological state, and for that we do biomonitoring, which sort of takes and sees if there's actually aquatic life and certain bioorganisms. So it certainly doesn't score high, but actually even where there are nutrients, you find certain life thrives on the nutrients, but it wouldn't be a healthy state of a river, yeah.
As the city, who do you think should take responsibility when there is indiscriminate dumping of waste on the banks of the river?
I'm not sure if I feel as if I've answered that question already. So forgive me if you could just maybe clarify, because clearly waste.
I'm asking who should take responsibility?
Well, waste is
because at the end of this process we have to make a finding.
Thank you for that question. Everyone obviously has a role. That's why we start with the education. Education is to say those who are polluting must basically dispose of their waste differently. So that is the responsibility number one. And of course, if we find people there, because that is in violation of the bylaws, we would then act upon that individual. If we don't find that person, we have ways of, when resources allow, cleaning up the rivers. And when we are really constrained, then we go on volunteer programs like the one I've just invited you on the 21st, where people go in on a voluntary basis to clean up. So it's something that I wish it's not to be just a city's responsibility. I think we must all come to the party, but the city also has a huge chunk to it.
Thank you, City Manager and your team. Thank you for cooperating with these investigations. Should we require any more information, we will do so in writing. You don't have to appear before the inquiry panel again. And thank you for your participation. Your excuse will now break for lunch and reconvene at 14:15. We have we have fruits again today. Thank you.